part of the book, so you've established this history of the growth of the welfare state and its ideological motive forces behind it. And then talked some at length about the conservative critique of it. But part of the book is a proposed, and you can correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this a little bit, but a compromise of sorts, in that liberals would accept some prudent limits on the welfare state, or at least sketching out outer bounds of how large it would be. And sort of in exchange for that, conservatives will at least accept the legitimacy of a safety net welfare state. So one question is, why would liberals take you up on this? I mean, you have 70 some odd years of it growing without end. Why stop now?
Well, they won't take me up on this because they think it's a good idea, because they read the book and say, what were we thinking? How foolish of us to have been engaged in this 8-decade project without thinking through the implications. Thank goodness this fellow has pointed out the error of our ways to us. They might, however, as a political matter, accept it as a compromise if they're forced to. That is, if both the economic realities, there isn't enough money and people are averse to the taxes or borrowing that would make that money materialize. And then as a political fact, if people just, if there's a sense that, you know, among the electorate, all right, in a sense, the New Deal question, we'll treat it as settled. Yes, we're going to have a government that makes sure that because you got a low score on your SAT exam, or because the company you work for was run by irresponsible people who or just faced bad market stuff, you're not going to have a crappy life because of those kind of random things. We're going to make sure that there are sort of transitional help for most people that will keep, you know, the safety net intact. But not everybody needs that. In a nation as wealthy as ours, wealthy enough to have the welfare state we have, which is big and sort of sprawling and poorly managed, we're certainly wealthy enough, one, to have a better, better targeted, better managed welfare state, and two, we're wealthy enough that most Americans don't need most of what the welfare state does to be helping everybody to be to use a phrase that I borrow from William Buckley, to be blackening the sky with crisscrossing dollars, to allow everybody to have the impression that the mathematical impossibility that if the government taxes and redistributes money furiously and in a sufficiently complex manner, then everybody somehow can come out as a net importer of these dollars that are flying across the sky. Right. We can get past that, and we can. And I think if conservatives make a sort of an electoral progress on that point, then liberals, not because they like the idea, but because in the same way that a lot of Democrats in 1981 voted for the Reagan tax cuts. They didn't think it was a good idea. They thought they were going to lose their jobs if they voted against them. I think if this kind of appeal could have, and this may be where I'm not being gloomy enough, has the potential to have that kind of impact. I mean, the point is, you know, as Henny Youngman used to say, compared to what? I mean, something like, I mean, what I'm describing, I didn't mention in the book because it became a sort of a well-known fact in our political life after I wrote the book. But the Congressman Paul Ryan's Roadmap for America's Future, which I think the crucial thing it does is to means test and voucherize the government's big entitlement programs. That is the spirit, the gist of what I'm proposing towards the end of Never Enough. And it'll be, as we can see from the reaction to Ryan's roadmap, it'll be a very hard thing to accomplish, but all of the other things strike me as being at least as hard and maybe more difficult. Going on borrowing to keep the welfare state we have intact does not look like a promising way to go. Raising taxes, keeping the welfare state we have intact, not increasing the deficit, and relying solely on tax increases to sort of make good on the promises that have built up over the past 8 decades, I think is highly unlikely. There was an excellent paper written by three folks at the Tax Policy Center about what it would mean. They asked, supposing rather than the projected deficits for the coming decade, we want to keep the federal deficit in the years 2015 through 2019 at 2% of GDP, which doesn't sound like a heroic achievement, but would at least mean that the federal debt was growing more, was shrinking as a portion of the economy. And they said, how do we do that without making any program trims, simply through income tax increases? And it turns out that you get back to where we were before not only before the 1981 tax cuts, but before the 1963 ones. You get back to top marginal rates above 90%. Especially if you're committed to keeping President Obama's ludicrous promise that no one would making less than $250,000 a year would see any sort of tax increase during his administration. So I think means testing is a hard road, but it seems like all the other roads we might take instead look to me to be even harder.
One, let me offer what a defender of the status quo and the open-ended nature of the current welfare state might put forward as an objection to having to put bounds on it. It's actually something that you raised in the book. And this is an area of particular interest to me of late, which is you pointed out in the discussion over income inequality, for example, there are non-economic factors that are contributing mightily, I would say, to the rise in income inequality, in particular sociological explanations. So the breakdown, the collapse of the traditional family as a driver of income inequality. Well, that's something that's totally unpredictable in terms of our cultural future and sociological dynamics like that. So a prudent liberal may say, well, because we don't know that, of course they'd have to admit that progress is not inevitable, certainly in the cultural sphere, for example. But because we can have drivers that we can't predict of the problems that we're going to have, it makes sense to leave it open-ended. And you've actually just made my point.
Well, I don't think conceding that point requires us in a way to concede very much. I mean, we have to be humble about the ability of sort of before the fact theorizing of any kind of framework or any sort of rationale to be determinative of the particular policies that are going to be carried out down the road. So I think that the degree of sort of operational flexibility that liberals are calling for, as George Will likes to say, up to a point are the most important words in the English language. Up to a point, it makes a great deal of sense, simply because the world is going to be more interesting and complicated than we can predict or imagine, and the best way to discredit a theory is to carry it out sort of relentlessly and ruthlessly in defiant disregard of any new facts or conditions that emerge. No, I don't want to do that. But I'm saying that the operational latitude that liberals are insisting on is not a way of implementing a theory. It's an excuse for having a theory about what the welfare state ought to do, and that we don't want to have. We need to have some sense of the social good and that we're pursuing, the means we will or the means we won't entertain to advance it. And this is where I think the not merely a-theoretical, but anti-theoretical of the liberal enterprise has been damaging to the country, and if scrutinized and pressed, damaging to liberalism itself.